Chapter 1 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. Origin of the Family Green, the Short and Simple Annals of the Poor. John P. Green, the subject of this sketch, was born in the old town of New Bern, North Carolina, on the 2nd day of April, 1845. His parents were John R. Green and Temperance Green, both of whom were free colored people of mixed blood and highly respected by the people of both races in that community. John R. Green, the father, was the reputed son of John Stanley, spelled by him Stanley, of North Carolina, who was the son of John Wright Stanley of the same place, and who, during our Revolutionary War, for a long period of time maintained a fleet of 14 privateers in the vicinity of the West India Islands, which preyed upon British commerce quite successfully until, being attacked in its West Indian harbor of refuge by a portion of the British Navy, it was thoroughly destroyed, and Stanley betook himself to commerce and merchandise in the old North Carolina town, at that time the capital of the state. This is the same John Wright Stanley upon whose head, with that of William Gaston, a great revolutionary patriot of the same state and community, was placed a premium by the British military authorities during that war, and who, in the darkest days of the War of Independence, loaned General Nathaniel Greene the sum of £40,000, which I may say was never repaid to him. And when we consider the scarcity of money at that time, and that £40,000 was as valuable then as £200,000 is now, we can form a correct estimate of the patriotism of that son of the Revolution. It may interest the reader in passing to know that Gaston was murdered by British spies for the bounty which was offered for his head, but Stanley lived to see the end of the war and enjoy the blessings of liberty for many years under our glorious stars and stripes. John Stanley, my reputed grandfather, was widely noted for his legal lore and successful practice at the bar of North Carolina. It was said of him that he never lost a case, but as to the truthfulness of this statement I am somewhat incredulous, unless it be a fact that he had very few cases, or that he was so uniformly successful in practice that it became a proverb that he lost no cases. That he was a great orator, politician, and statesman was well known. He was, for 7 consecutive sessions of the North Carolina House of Representatives, Speaker of the House, was in Congress once, and followed and sustained that great party of which Henry Clay was the famous leader, known as the Whig Party, and stood for America for Americans and the protection of American industries. This John Stanley, in the early part of the last century, became involved in a quarrel with Governor Richard Dobbs Spite of North Carolina, one of the original signers of our national Constitution, and accepting a challenge sent to him by Governor Spite, they fought a duel in which the governor was killed. This was a social and political calamity in the old North State, for a long time deplored, and did much to bring into hatred, scorn, and contempt a system of so-called honor which was finally outlawed under a heavy penalty. Herein, peculiarly enough, lies the explanation of this writer's name being John Green rather than John Stanley. My father's mother, Sarah Rice, a woman of African descent, had for years been a good and faithful maid-servant in the home of the unfortunate Governor Spite, and had exercised over the little girls and maidens of that august Southern family almost maternal care, a condition of affairs which I suspect few persons in the North, East, and West can adequately conceive of unless they lived in the South during the slavery era and became familiar with it, so close was the association between the Negro and mulatto nurses and their little wards that even down to the present day we often hear the signs of old Southern families, and some of the elderly ladies from the same section refer to their old black mammies with accents of love and affection. Such was the love and affection for Sarah Rice on the part of the Spite family that they set her free, manumitted, emancipated her, giving her at the same time the sum of $200 as required by the law of the state at that time. Previous to this important event in the life of this favored nurse, she had been delivered of a wee boy baby, whom she had named for herself only Johnny Rice, not daring to disclose his true paternity, but subsequently having attained her freedom, she called him Johnny Green, for a little boy whom she had nursed. For Johnny, having been born when his mother was still in the bonds of slavery, followed his mother's slave condition, and not having been manumitted with her, he was still the slave of the Spite estate, and to let it be known that he was the natural son of John Stanley, the fatal ball from whose pistol had killed the governor would in all probability have sealed his fate adversely. So Johnny Green became in later days John R. Rice Green, and this writer, his son, has flaunted the green flag as John P. Patterson Green ever since. Sometimes, really, fact is stranger than fiction. Having stated it as a matter of fact that my father, John R. Green, was the reputed son of John Stanley, a son of the Revolution, the skeptical may demand the proof of this fact. If so, I submit the following data. A. Sarah Rice, John R. Green's mother, declared that Stanley was his father. B. John Stanley, on his dying bed, sent for my father, and to him in person acknowledged his paternity, giving him at the same time a steel-engraved likeness of himself, which we still have in our family. C. My father, it was generally conceded, bore a more striking resemblance to Stanley than any other of his sons, except that he was a shade darker. D. It was common rumor in that community that Stanley was his father. To the best of my knowledge, the most illustrious son of my grandfather, John Stanley, was the Honorable Edward Stanley, M.C., who was leader of the Whig party in Congress in the 40s. This gentleman and scholar was later on the first nominee of the Republican Party for governor of California, and afterwards, during the Reconstruction period subsequent to our Civil War, was appointed by President Andrew Johnson provisional governor of North Carolina. I've gone into this matter somewhat minutely because I am proud of the fact that I can trace my descent from a family so distinguished in both camp and state, and also because it furnishes to the student of society and social standards in these United States a concrete example of how fearfully and wonderfully a large percentage of the colored people here are made. I shall end any further consideration of the Stanley family by submitting the following epitaph from the pen of the late William Gaston of North Carolina, who was the son of that William Gaston, the friend and associate of John Wright Stanley, who died a martyr in the cause of American liberty. This William Gaston, who wrote the epitaph, was noted in his day and down to the present as having been one of nature's noblemen and the greatest Chief Justice and jurist his state ever produced. He was from the first John Stanley's close personal friend, both at the bar and in the political arena, and well knew whereof he spoke. The following is the epitaph. John Stanley, eldest son of John Wright Stanley and Anne, his wife, born 1774, died August 2nd, 1833. Few persons in any community have occupied a more prominent station. Few have exercised a more powerful influence than this distinguished individual for many years held and exercised in our town and throughout our state. Long in the affectionate and grateful remembrance of all will live his genius, his learning, his courtesy, his eloquence, his virtues, his personal characteristics, and his public services. Gaston. My mother, Mrs. Temperance Durden Green, was a quadroon by blood, and was a direct descendant on both her father's and her mother's side from those Scottish and Yorkshire Englishmen who followed the flag and fortunes of the last Pretender, descendant of the unfortunate James II of England in 1745, and after having met disastrous defeat at Derby, almost at the gates of London, were expatriated and in large numbers found asylum in North Carolina, notably in the counties of Cumberland and Sampson, where by thrift and economy they left a numerous and wealthy progeny, as may be seen by tourists and others today. In the latter part of the 18th century, 1792, to be specific, there resided near the town of Clinton, in Sampson County, North Carolina, about 30 miles from the city, then town, of Fayetteville, in the same state, a family containing 2 beautiful daughters, of which a man, Chestnut, or Chestnut with 2 T's by name, was the head. This paterfamilias was a well-to-do farmer, and with his wife and daughters was known and respected far and wide by persons of his class. Moreover, since his daughters were young and comely, they were frequently favored by the calls of young gentlemen in the vicinage, who socially and financially deemed themselves their superiors. In the course of time the young ladies became greatly enamoured of two of these young men, but since they did not hasten to make to them proposals of marriage, they had recourse to the advice and services of a likely young colored man, the slave of their father, who advised them in the premises, with the result that ere long each became the mother of a little colored girl. One of these baby girls was named Obedience, which was transformed to Bede. This one was my grandmother, born in the same year as my father, 1793. The child of the other girl, sister of this first mother, was named Alice, but invariably, as long as she lived, called Alice. A glance will suggest that these two babies, being the offspring of one father by two sisters, were at once sisters and cousins. This condition during the womanhood of these two colored girls was doubly complicated when each girl presented to two white brothers severally a child, one of whom was my mother. If the foregoing is proof of a low moral status amongst both white and colored persons in that portion of these United States, at that time, place of the odium, where it belongs, not at the door of the poor slaves, nor should we forget that as far back as the time of Homer, when bondsmen were of every nationality and race, it became a maxim that Jove made it certain that whatever day makes man a slave takes half his worth away. Moreover, it seems to be a natural inclination governing dominant and oppressing men to take unjust advantages of unprotected females and others, as witness the Romans under Romulus taking by force the Sabine virgins and carrying them into captivity, and a more recent proof of my contention may be found in the conduct of the German warriors and the Reds of Russia, who have disregarded every sacred right of conjugal, maternal, and virginal purity. Under such conditions those damnable doctrines, might makes right, and to the victor belong the spoils, are an unspeakable curse. It may interest the reader to know that both those colored girls lived to a ripe old age. Bede, my grandmother, lived to be nearly 97 years of age, and had she not yielded to dread pneumonia, she would probably have rounded out a century. Alice was almost 90 years of age when she died. Both left behind them a numerous progeny, thus proving the fallacy of that scientific dogma that mulattoes cannot reproduce their species, for both were mulattoes, having white mothers and a Negro father. Granny Bede was in her youth and young womanhood a very strong and active woman, as the two anecdotes which follow concerning her will abundantly prove. When she was between 18 and 20 years of age, she had to some extent the care of the cows and other cattle belonging to the farm on which she was reared. On one occasion it became necessary to put a rope around the horns of a powerful steer, which was confined in the pen, but this being at a time remotely ulterior to the herding of cattle on our western prairies, and skillful lassoing of the same by our doughty cowboys, the men failed of success, and after repeated efforts and failures appealed to Bede, their keeper. "Here's Bede," they said, "they know her, let her try." No sooner said than done, for in a jiffy she vaulted over the fence of the pen, and noose in hand, dauntlessly approached, confronted the steer, lowering his head, the beast rushed at her. In this supreme moment Granny did not scream and faint, but grasping his horns, she held his nose to the ground until relieved, when she triumphantly climbed back over the fence, the cynosure of all eyes, the heroine of the moment, and even down to the present day in the estimation of this writer and others. The other incident follows. In 1872, when she was in the 79th year of her age, I visited her on a farm in the suburbs of Bennettsville, Marlborough County, South Carolina. The little cabin in which she then resided was on the roadside at the edge of a 50-acre cotton field, and it becoming necessary to call one of the hands to his dinner, she did not ring a bell or sound a horn, but with a stentorian voice called, "Louis, oh, Louis!" I can hear her to this day. "Come to dinner." Needless to say, Louis heard the gladsome summons, and dropping his hoe in his tracks, ran as the crow flies to that refreshment which his manly labour entitled him to, and which made a mere dish of corned beef, and more palatable to him than any nectar brewed by a fabled god. My dear mother was a born Spartan, with not the slightest suspicion of African blood traceable in features or complexion, with brown eyes, auburn hair, high cheek bones, high forehead, straight nose, and thin compressed lips. She was a study for every one who was introduced to her as a colored woman, and yet she married a colored man, not disowning her descent, and to her death in her 81st year of age she commingled with her colored friends. Some conception of my mother's energy and determined spirit may be gained from the fact that when she was about 20 years of age, she walked from Clinton, Sampson County, North Carolina, to Fayetteville, North Carolina, in less than one day, arriving in Fayetteville in a foundered condition, carrying her shoes in her hand. When she arrived in Cleveland, she had occasion to transact some business with Mr. Blair, who owned the extensive real estate on the south side of Prospect Street, just east of 30th Street. Mr. Blair said to her, "Of what nationality are you?" Mother answered, "I am a colored woman." "Well," replied Mr. Blair, "I wouldn't tell it." Mother could wash and iron, cook, make any article of wearing apparel for either man or woman, from a shirt to a Prince Albert coat. In addition to all this, she had been taught and thoroughly understood how to card wool or cotton, spin with the wheel, and weave at the loom. She could gather the cotton from the stalk in the field with her own hands, without assistance, card, spin, weave, and manufacture it into a suit of clothes. She could even knit the stockings of the family. The first kite ever flown by me was attached to a ball of twine, which my mother had manufactured for me out of the raw cotton. When she, a comely lass of 24 summers, married my father in 1837, he took her to a beautiful home, which was still standing in 1897, when I last visited old Newbern town, and was in use as a parsonage for the Presbyterian pastor and his family. The interior decorations of this house by the carpenter in the 30s cost in cash $1,800, an amount which would purchase then what $5,000 would today. Having given a survey of the Stanley family and others of his ancestors, I will now proceed to give an outline of my father's brief but useful and remarkable life. And here and now I dare assert that, taking into consideration the time and place of his birth, his enslaved condition, his absolute handicap in the way of obtaining even the rudiments of an education, his was one of the most remarkable careers that stand attested by any other colored man of his age and generation. It is a peculiar and interesting fact, which I may mention in passing, that my father and I together have lived in portions of 3 centuries, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th centuries. Father was born, as I have said, in the year 1793. He lived until November 1850, while this writer, having been born in 1845 in the 19th century, is still living in the 20th century. In addition to the foregoing, it may be noted that we each have lived in 2 centuries, my father in the 18th and 19th century, and this writer in the 19th and 20th centuries. My father having been born of a slave mother, before she was manumitted, his estate followed that of his unfortunate mother. He was a slave. Ye gods, fancy the son of a Stanley in slavery! Yet stranger conditions than this have existed in the southern states of this country. The natural colored sons and daughters of many slave masters have been openly sold on the auction block, and the proceeds of those sales have gone to line the pockets of their unnatural parents. Little Johnny Green was of such small and delicate frame, even up to the time when he entered his teens, that it was somewhat of a problem what disposition should be made of him. A laborious occupation for him was out of the question, and as for a professional career, that was not to be thought of. Finally, it was determined to apprentice him to a tailor, and the resolution was no sooner adopted than executed. At the age of 13, in 1806, when by reason of diminutive size he was dubbed Jack the Weasel, he first crossed his legs on the board and commenced a career which continued for 43 years, when death ended it. Father related many instances of shameful treatment of him by some of the apprentice boys during his apprenticeship, who frequently picked on him, but to his last day he spoke in terms of superlative gratitude of the protection often extended to him by a Frenchman, Durand by name, whose memory I laud and magnify to this day, who can tell the limitation of little deeds of kindness, little words of love. He also often spoke of his meager supply of food, when old Aunt Hannah, his caretaker, would at times prepare and serve him cush, a dish which I suspect few of the present generation know anything about. Having been served with the same dish in my childhood, I hereby submit that recipe for making that inexpensive and palatable dish. Take crusts and crumbs of cold cornbread, moisten them moderately, put them into a spider frying pan containing a modicum of hot grease, and let them fry until all are nicely browned. Then voila, a dish for a hungry boy. We think we are experiencing hard times in our day, and we are in many instances, but what will you say when I avow to you that the mistress of his salve cousin Maria, often before sending her out into the street to perform an errand, would grease her lips in token of the fact that she had been eating meat? Father considering his direct lineal descent, was in reason necessarily an apt pupil, and in the course of a year or two he began to earn money by doing extra work during his spare hours, and by occupying some of the hours allotted to him for sleep in this way. At the age of 21, when his apprenticeship was ended, he was the proud possessor of $1,000, which he ultimately used in buying his freedom, for he related that after he had married a free wife he could no longer endure the yoke of slavery. When he attained his liberty, he had already learned to read and write. In fact, he had to some extent mastered the 3 R's. No school door swung open or even ajar for him. He learned the alphabet in some mysterious way, for it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write. In this respect he was in a sadder plight than the great Frederick Douglass, for he, before he escaped from slavery, had some side instruction, but father had no instructor, save a copy of the then Webster's Elementary Spelling Book, which was his inseparable companion by night and by day. And with the assistance of a blind man, whom at times he led through the street, he was gradually inducted into the mystery of reading. The method in practice between my daddy and the blind man was as follows. Dad would call the letters of a word, and the blind man would tell him how to pronounce it, and Jack the Weasel, like his forebears, being naturally clever, ere long was reading in the same little book the monosyllabic sentences beginning, "No man may put off the law of God." It may surprise the reader to learn that in after years, without any additional schooling, my father kept the single and double entry books of accounts used in his business, that at the time of his death he owned a large collection of books, amongst which I can at this late day recall the Life and Speeches of Henry Clay, the Church Register, which contained thorough accounts of nationwide transactions in the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States, a History of the World by Sir Walter Raleigh, Rollin's Ancient History, and many others. In fact, so choice and in some instances rare was his collection of books that when, by order of my mother, they were sold at public auction, the bidding was spirited and the competition noteworthy to obtain possession of some of them, even amongst the wealthy slaveholders who were in attendance. Unquestionably, my father possessed a great desire for literary attainments, and did his utmost to reach to some excellence along that line. This talent on his part was recognized during all his life. Men of learning and discrimination sought him in his store and engaged him in conversation to such an extent that much of his valuable time was lost in this way, and even the bishops of the Episcopal Church, of which he was a member, Bishops Ives and Atkinson respectively, always visited and conversed with him when they made their Episcopal visits to Old Christ Church in that town. In this connection it may not be amiss to state that, although born and reared a slave and residing in a slaveholding community, my daddy so deported himself as to merit and receive kind and courteous treatment from all. He owned and occupied with his family a pew in Christ Episcopal Church, which was the most wealthy and aristocratic congregation in that part of the state, while the other members, with 2 exceptions, sat in the galleries, and as proving how tenacious he was of what he conceived to be his rights, it may be stated that when the Reverend Dr. Buxton White, a clergyman of the Episcopal Church, married him and my mother in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in 1837, and did not wear his clerical robe, he would not give him a bill which he carried in his vest pocket for him. I may add in passing that my father, who never aspired to be called a poet in any sense, yet undoubtedly was possessed of the afflatus to some extent, for he read the higher poets with avidity, and had committed many excerpts to memory, which in animated conversation he often repeated. As an illustration, I will here record one which I have carried in my memory for 65 years, and during that time I have never seen it in print. Where are those names which set the world on fire? Where does the pride of Rome and Greece retire? Caesar's dread name now marks the butcher's dog, while Cato saws wood and Scipio drives the hog. Seek ye for Pompey, search the tanner's yard, while Nero you'll find your kitchen's faithful guard. As tending to show that father was possessed of a keen sense of humor, and could on occasion extemporize a little rhyme, I will give the following illustration. One Sunday afternoon, when he and some of his boon companions were promenading one of the principal streets of the town, he noticed that one of them, Boston by name, was wearing a coat which had been made in his tailor's shop, and that it had been dyed black. Like a flash he slapped Boston on his shoulder, and exclaimed, "This coat I know it once was brown, and shone all o'er this new-burned town. But now, alas, this coat is black, and shines upon poor Boston's back." It is needless to remark that this thrust drew forth much merriment at the expense of poor Boston, but since it was confined to the friendly group, it was taken for a joke as was intended. The following epitaph, written composed by my father, was engraved on the marble headstone placed by him at the head of his first wife's grave in grateful and loving remembrance of her. She died beloved and even revered by the whole community in which she was born, and passed her useful and devout life. Sacred to the memory of Sally Green, who departed this life March 29th, 1837, aged 45 years, 6 months. A constant friend, a tender, loving wife, prudent in all the needful cares of life, and when arrested by the hand of death, in faith and hope resigned her mortal breath. Her soul, we trust, doth dwell with God above, and there drinks in the copious streams of love. In the course of father's long experience as a tailor and merchant tailor, he had many apprentices, some of whom became quite noteworthy by reason of their attainments and mercantile successes. The most conspicuous of these was the late Reverend William J. Alston, a native of Raleigh, North Carolina, who for 8 years was under my father's eye and finished his apprenticeship cum magna laude. William, as he was called, was for years bubbling over with animal spirits. He was rude, boisterous, and untidy, and more than once had to be disciplined. It was the general opinion of William that he was a ne'er-do-well, and that he would come to no good end. On one occasion he tied up his small wardrobe in a bandana handkerchief and shipped to sail before the mast. However, he was intercepted by my father before the departure of the schooner, taken with his luggage back to his home, soundly flogged, and given some wholesome advice for his government in the future. Shortly thereafter he was invited to participate in the exercises of a singing society which held Sunday afternoon sessions. He accepted the invitation, became a regular and most interested member, and ultimately announced his intention to study theology for the Episcopal ministry. This resolution having been received with marked favor by his father, the late Oscar Alston of Raleigh, North Carolina, he was in a way matriculated in an institution at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where he was prepared for college. After that he was graduated from Oberlin College in the later 50s, and finally at Gambier, Ohio, became a full-fledged priest in the Episcopal Church. In many years this true and tried servant of God, as rector of both St. Philip's Church, New York City, and St. Thomas Church, Philadelphia, preached Jesus Christ and him crucified, and his sweet exemplary life was as a beacon light to many who perhaps otherwise would have been stranded and lost. The following anecdote, related by Reverend Alston to my dear mother in my presence, goes far to prove the almost intolerable condition which prevailed, even in religious educational institutions in the United States prior to the Civil War. Being the only colored student in Kenyon College prior to the abolition of slavery, Alston was the cynosure of all eyes, and at times not a little at a loss for companionship and even association. To such an extent was this true that on one occasion, while taking a stroll in the suburbs of the old college town, he was confronted by a cow, who, honoring him with a friendly stare, turned out of his way, gave him gangway, as the vulgar expression of our day would have it. Delighted at the unusual recognition and courtesy shown him by the humble brute, Alston saluted her and exclaimed, "Good morning, Mrs. Cow." It goes without saying that we had a hearty laugh over the incident. Another story related by him at the same time is recalled by the former. During a summer vacation, while exerting himself to add to the contents of his meager purse, he shipped as a waiter on a steamer plying between Cleveland and Lake Superior ports. On arriving at Duluth, Escanaba, or some one of the other seaport towns, he left the steamer and went in search of some other remunerative employment. The older readers of this narrative will recall that during the later part of the 50s, the whole country was in the grip of a most trying panic, which made it almost impossible to procure remunerative labor at any price. William, in that remote section, soon made this discovery, and since the boat had gone and funds were extremely low, he was open to any job that presented itself. He soon found it in the shape of a small mountain of earth, which had been formed by the excavation of a large hole to be used as a cellar. The owner of this mountain offered to pay him the sum of $35 and furnish him with a shovel and wheelbarrow if he would remove it. In a jiffy he accepted the proposition, and without delay, having peeled off his coat, disregarding his flaccid muscles and tender hands, he bent to his task. At the end of 2 weeks he had finished the undertaking and received his compensation, which he had in his pocket when the boat returned to convey him back to Cleveland. Another father's apprentice who was graduated with honor from his workshop was the late Jerry Harvey of Boston, Massachusetts. Mr. Harvey, near the close of his apprenticeship, had the sad misfortune, while playfully pointing a gun at a comrade on Christmas Day, to kill him by its accidental discharge. In North Carolina, in the 30s, such an occurrence was an exceedingly grave affair, for the old criminal common law of England, with only slight modification, was still in vogue, which made the condition of the offender vastly different than now under our enlightened and merciful regime. However, my father went to the front for him, and as usual he received a respectful hearing in behalf of the unfortunate young man, and the matter was compromised by allowing the defendant to leave the state, not to return again. Without any delay, Mr. Harvey betook himself to Boston, where he followed the trade which had been taught him, and being very successful along this line, his name became well known, especially amongst colored people in all sections of New England. At that period in the history of the South, Mr. Harvey might with propriety have paraphrased our well-known school declamation, beginning, "Banished from Rome, Newbern, what's banished but set free from daily contact with the things I loathed." My father was a man of generous impulses. He really, at times, when pressed to bestow a favor, could not say no. And since the homestead exemptions to heads of families in that state at that time were extremely scant, the usual result followed. He was compelled to meet the defaults of others by exhausting his earnings and sacrificing his properties. Added to this was the fact that on two several occasions his establishments were destroyed by fire. On both occasions he was the victim of neighboring conflagrations. It is scarcely necessary to say that the amount of insurance recovered by him at that time was of slight value, hence his was an almost total loss. Twice he bought some of his relatives when being sold at public auction, being entreated by them to save them from the speculator. Note: the speculator was a person who traveled from one location to another, buying slaves for resale and speculation in the cotton, cane, and rice-producing sections of the Gulf States. The amounts thus advanced by him, it is needless to say, were never returned to him. Being importuned by two frail mulatto youths, apprentices of his, for whom he entertained regard and sympathy, he bought them on their promise to repay him the money advanced in installments. Sad to relate, both these young men died of tuberculosis before they had paid to him a tenth of the money advanced, $1,000 for each of them. Here again was an additional loss of $2,000, which, we must not forget, was then worth at least 3 times as much as at the present time. Ultimately, of course, he was stripped of all his earthly possessions save his honor, and broken in body, bereft of his redundant humor, good cheer, and genial, whole-souled, winsome conversation, he betook himself to his bed, from which he was never to rise again. The sheriff came, levied on everything, save the sad and downcast widow and 3 forlorn children, ranging in age from 11 years to 9 months. This writer, being second in order, was 5 years of age, small and weak for the age. "Lift me up and let me die," he said to our dear mother, after a lingering illness, and so died John R. Green, of Newbern, North Carolina, of whom it may be said he loved not wisely but too well. The more I reflect on the current of my father's eventful life, of his early struggles for existence, his social limitations, his vaulting ambitions, his consuming zeal, and his unspeakable disappointments, the more I wonder at the phenomenal successes which attended his efforts. He was broad and cosmopolitan in his views, and although he was a colored American in a slave state, carrying on his shoulders all that incubus of caste proscription which characterized the time and place in which he lived, yet he counted amongst his friends and quasi-associates many of the wealthy as well as the poor whites in the place of his residence. It was no uncommon occurrence to meet in his place of business illiterate persons of the white race, who took advantage of his literary attainments to procure begging petitions and other documents for public use. And after his death I was accosted frequently by persons of both races, who would ask me, "Whose boy are you?" I would answer, "I'm the son of John R. Green." Then invariably the reply would be, "Well, son, you must be a good boy, for your father was a good man." Father was very fond of aquatic sports. If a vessel was to be launched, or any race rowed on the river, he was sure to be one of the spectators, and as for swimming, boating, and fishing, they were the acme of his out-of-door pleasures. The town of Newbern North Carolina is located in the triangle formed by the juncture of the Neuse and Trent rivers, where they unite to form Pamlico Sound. These rivers, as well as the Sound, are well stocked with many species of most delicious seafood, not omitting oysters, clams, and hard and soft shell crabs. So fond was he of seafood that when the hegira of colored people from the south to the north was at flood tide during the decade prior to the Civil War, and especially during the debates in Congress about the year 1850, and he was asked whether or not he intended to join in the procession, he answered that he would never leave North Carolina until he could carry the Neuse and Trent rivers with him. And it is a notable fact that as long as we remained in that state, he was the only person who knowingly had ever walked over the frozen surface of the Trent River at New Bern, where it is from a half to a mile wide. This feat he daringly accomplished during the winter of 1833-4, as my mother informed me. As a workman, my father was without a superior in that section of the state. He designed and executed all styles of clothing and uniforms which the trade demanded, even going back to old continental styles and theatrical costumes. In closing this brief sketch of the life of my dear father, I shall use the lines of Lord Byron, as dedicated to a poetic enthusiast of his time, White by name, only paraphrasing the word or two to make them applicable. Unhappy soul, when life was in its spring, and thy young muse just waved her joyous wing, the spoiler swept thy soaring lyre away, which else had sounded an immortal lay. Oh, what a noble life was there undone, when science's self destroyed her favourite son! Yes, she too much indulged thy fond pursuit. She sowed the seed, but death has reaped the fruit. 'Twas thine own genius struck the fatal blow, and helped to plant the wound that laid thee low. Like the struck eagle stretched upon the plain, no more through rolling clouds to soar again, viewed his own feather on the fatal dart, and winged the shaft that quivered in his heart. Keen were his pangs, yet keener far to feel. He nursed the pinion which impelled the steel, while the same plumage which had warmed his nest drank the last life drop of his bleeding breast. Here begins in an humble way an epic, to end when and how God in his great wisdom, power, and mercy wills it to end. We follow the little sombre hearse by twos in the direction of Christ Church Cemetery, now popularly known there as Rock Cemetery. Mother supported on the arm of a true and tried old friend, leading the cortege, this writer clinging to the arm of his elder sister next, a few friends following. The beautiful burial services of the Episcopal Church having been read, and the final earth to earth, dust to dust having been pronounced forlorn and needy, we turn away to confront and fight, to strut and fret, our more or less gloomy way, widowed and fatherless for many years to come. Mother, glum, demure, and determined as ever a Spartan mother showed herself, turns from her palatial residence of yore, mahogany furniture, cut glass, silver service, the ministration of maid servants and hosts of friends, and repairs with her little brood to a rude cottage in an obscure section of the old town, confronted on the opposite side of the narrow street by the ancient graveyard, gloomy with its weeping willows, funereal cypresses, and moss-covered cedars, and flanked on either side by dwellings tenanted by persons the like of whom she had never known as associates, and who, on occasions, would publicly proclaim in clarion tones, "It makes no difference how high the eagle flies in the air, he's got to come down to git his support," as the immortal bard puts it. Oh, what a falling off, my countrymen, was there! End of chapter 1.